The shoes cost less than a single glass of the champagne being poured 3 feet away, and the heiress made very sure that everyone in the ballroom knew it. She lifted one manicured finger, pointed it straight down at the cracked navy shoes on the maid's feet, and laughed until the laughter spread like spilled wine across the marble floor, and the maid named Oluchi stood frozen against a cold pillar, a silver tray trembling in her hands, while a man no one in that gleaming room had dared to interrupt all evening quietly set down his glass and began to walk toward her. Nobody knew yet why he was crossing the floor. Nobody knew that the cheap shoes they were laughing at were the same shoes that had once walked a starving, ruined man back to his whole life. But they were about to find out, and by the time that night was over, every proud mouth in that room would learn the oldest lesson there is, that God lifts up the lowly and brings down the ones who think too much of themselves. But to understand why the richest man in that ballroom would leave a circle of important people to take the hand of a girl in a borrowed apron, you have to go back to before the gala, before the gowns and the chandeliers, to a kitchen where the work began long before the sun came up. Oluchi was 24 years old, and she had been a housegirl in the Okafor mansion for 2 years. She rose every morning at 4:30, while the great house still lay in blue darkness, and she lit the stove and set the water to boil and laid out the silver before anyone with money in their name ever stirred. She was slender, with deep brown skin and large dark eyes that had learned to look at the floor, and she wore the same plain sage green and cream dress with a white apron that they gave the kitchen staff. On her feet she wore one pair of shoes. They were navy, made of cheap stiff faux leather, and the left sole had split clean across the ball of the foot months ago. She could not afford new ones, so every few nights she sat on a low stool under the single kitchen bulb and pressed a thin bead of glue into the crack and held it shut with her thumbs until it set, and wore them again the next day. They were not beautiful, but they carried her. They had carried her a very long way. The mansion belonged to Chief Okafor, who was rarely home and was ruled in his absence by his wife, Ezin, and their daughter, Adaku. Ezin was a stately woman of 60, with graying hair she wrapped each morning in an elaborate gold jail, and she wore rich purple and gold lace and heavy coral beads, and carried a carved cane she did not need to walk with, only to point with. She had a way of looking at the people who served her as though they were a small stain she had decided to tolerate. And her daughter, Adaku, 27, sleek and sharp-cheeked and beautiful in the cold way of a polished knife, had learned everything she knew from watching her mother. Adaku changed her gold jewelry 3 times a day. She left full plates of food for the staff to throw away. And she had decided, somewhere in the years Oluchi had served her, that the quiet girl with the worn shoes was put on this earth, chiefly to be reminded of how far beneath her she stood. There was only one person in that house who made the work bearable, and her name was Bisi. Bisi was a kitchen maid too, 26, with a round, kind face and short, twisted hair, and a laugh she could not always keep behind her teeth even when Madame Ezine was near. The two of them shared a small room off the back of the kitchen, and at night, with the great house finally silent, they sat on the edge of Oluchi's narrow bed and ate bread and laughed and dreamed out loud about lives they did not yet have. Bisi was the one who first said, only half joking, that she had never in her life met anyone as good as Oluchi and could not for the life of her understand why God let the good ones stay poor. Oluchi only smiled and said that goodness was not a thing you did to be paid for it. It was a thing you did because it was the only thing worth doing. And then she pressed another little line of glue into her shoe and went to sleep. If you have ever watched someone good get written off, quietly carrying more than anyone sees, never raising their voice, never demanding the thing they have more than earned, and some stubborn part of you has wanted, just once, to see that person lifted up and the proud ones put in their place, then you already understand why this channel exists, and you already belong here. Take 1 second, right now, before the night turns, and subscribe to Hidden Crown Stories, because the people who do are exactly the people these stories are for, and what happens to Oluchi before this night is over is the part I have been waiting the whole story to tell you. Because there was something about Oluchi that not even Bisi knew. 2 years before, on a night so wet the gutters of the city ran like rivers, before she had ever come to the Okafor house, Oluchi had been walking home from a cleaning job with the last few naira in her pocket and a single bread roll in her bag. And under the broken light of a bus shelter she had found a man, soaked through to the bone, shaking, his good dark jacket ruined and his shoes full of water, and he had the look of a man who had lost everything so recently that he did not yet know how to hold his own face. People walked past him, the rain came down, and Oluchi, who had almost nothing herself, stopped. She held her small umbrella out over him, though it meant the rain ran down her own back and soaked her cheap navy shoes black. She gave him the bread roll from her bag, the only food she had until morning. And when she saw that he had no way home, she pressed her last folded naira into his wet hand and told him which bus to take and where it would carry him, and she waited with him in the rain until it came so that he would not be alone. He tried to ask her name. She told him it did not matter, that she had only done what anyone should do, and she helped him up the step of the bus and watched it pull away into the dark. She never expected to see him again. She did not even know who he was. She walked home in the rain in her ruined shoes, and the next morning she dried them by the stove and glued the seam that the water had loosened, and she went on with her small, hard life and almost forgot it had happened at all. It would be wrong to tell you that Oluchi had always been poor and never known anything better, because that was not the truth, and the truth was part of why her gentleness ran so deep. She had been born in a small town in the East, the only daughter of a schoolteacher father who had loved books and a mother who had sold cloth in the market, and for the first years of her life there had been enough. Not riches, but enough, a clean small house and shoes that fit, and a father who read to her at night and told her that a person's worth was never in what they wore but in how they treated the one who could do nothing for them in return. Then the fever came one rainy season and took her father in a single terrible week, and the small house and the books and the comfort all went with him, sold one piece at a time to pay for the medicine that had not saved him. Her mother worked herself thin and gray trying to keep the two of them afloat, and Oluchi, still only a girl, learned to cook and clean and carry and ask for nothing. When her mother died too, worn out before her time, Oluchi was alone in the world with nothing but her father's words still ringing in her ears, that worth is measured by mercy, and a single suitcase, and a pair of cheap navy shoes she had bought in the market with the very last of the money, because she had needed something that would last. She came to the city to find work. She found the Okafor house, and she carried her father's lesson into a place that had never heard of it, and lived it out every day among people who would have laughed at her for it, exactly as they were about to. That was the thing about Oluchi that the proud could never have understood. Her kindness was not weakness, and it was not ignorance of how the world worked. She knew precisely how the world worked. She had simply decided, as her father had decided before her, that she would not let a cruel world make her into a cruel woman, no matter what it cost her, and it had cost her plenty. It had cost her better jobs, because she would not flatter or scheme for them. It had cost her the easy road of bitterness, which is the road most people take when life treats them as life had treated her. She chose, every single morning, in the cold blue dark of that kitchen, to be good when no one was watching and no one would ever reward it. And so when a soaked, ruined stranger had appeared under a broken light on the worst night of her life and his, she had not even had to think about it. The choice had already been made years before, by a girl beside a market stall and a father who read to her at night. She had simply done what she had always done. What Oluchi did not know, could not have known, was that the shaking man under the bus shelter had been Chinedu, and Chinedu was not a poor man at all, or rather he had been for exactly that one season of his life. He had built a company young and fast, and watched a partner he trusted gut it from the inside and flee the country, leaving Chinedu's name in the newspapers beside words like ruin and disgrace and finished. On the night Oluchi found him, he had lost his offices, his accounts, and very nearly his will to keep breathing, and he had been walking the city in the rain with no destination because he had nowhere left that was his. A stranger's umbrella, a stranger's bread, a stranger's last few coins, given by a girl who had less than he had ever had, and gave it anyway. That kindness had reached him at the exact hour he had stopped believing in any, and it had been the small, stubborn ember that he warmed his hands at while he climbed, over the next 2 years, all the way back, and then far higher than he had ever stood before. He rebuilt the company, he built it bigger, and quietly, in the spaces between the work, he searched for her, the girl with the kind, tired face and the cracked navy shoes who had not wanted her name. Remembered, he never found her. The city was vast and she was poor, and she had left no trace but a warmth he could not forget. He gave to the poor in her honor without knowing if she was among them. He told himself that one day, somehow, he would find a way to thank her. He simply had no idea that on the night he finally would, she would be carrying a tray of water glasses through the very same room. The search had become something close to a private religion for him. In the first months after he found his feet again, Chinedu had sent a man to the part of the city where the bus shelters stood to ask the shopkeepers and the conductors and the women who sold roasted corn on the corner whether anyone knew a young woman, kind, poor, who had been out walking in the rain that night 2 years gone. It was hopeless, and he knew it was hopeless. 1,000 poor young women walked those streets, and none of them had any reason to remember one wet stranger. But he could not stop. There was a wound in him that had nothing to do with the money he had lost, a wound that came from how close he had walked to the edge of giving up entirely. And the only thing that had ever touched it was the memory of an umbrella held over his head by a girl who had less than he did. He had been a hard young man before his fall, ambitious, impatient, certain that the world was a ladder and that the people below you on it were simply slower or weaker than you were. The rain had cured him of that, and the cure had a face he could not find. He began to fund shelters and food kitchens and scholarships for the children of the poor, pouring money into the very streets that had nearly swallowed him, and people praised his generosity and called him a great man. And he let them, but in his own heart he knew the truth. He was not being generous. He was looking for one particular girl in every grateful face, and he was trying, in the only way he knew how, to pay back a debt that the one person it was owed to had refused to let him pay. He had very nearly stopped believing he would ever find her. That, in fact, was why he had come to the gala at all. Not for the heiress everyone whispered was being dangled before him, whose name he did not even bother to learn, and not for the company of the city's rich, whose flattery he had long since stopped tasting. He had come because his foundation was funding the night, and his people had told him it would mean a great deal to the cause if the benefactor appeared in person just once, and because some tired, dutiful part of him had thought, perhaps there, perhaps among the people serving, among the ones the rich never look at, perhaps tonight. He had stopped truly expecting it. He had simply never stopped looking, and so he had put on a plain suit, because he had learned to hate the way wealth announced itself, and he had driven himself to a party full of people hunting for a billionaire. And he had walked in unknown, with 2 years of quiet searching folded up behind his calm, dark eyes, looking, as he always looked now, everywhere he went, for a girl in a pair of cracked navy shoes. The gala was Azin's triumph. It was a great charity ball, the kind the city's wealthiest families competed to be seen at, and the Okafors were hosting it in the grand ballroom of the estate. A sweeping marble staircase descending to a vast floor, round tables draped in crimson and gold, crystal chandeliers hung like frozen fountains of light. Azin had spent a fortune. Adaku had spent 2 weeks deciding on a gown and had emerged in floor-length emerald green sequins that threw light like scales. There was a reason for all of it beyond vanity. Word had spread that the foundation funding the entire evening, and quietly, it was whispered, much of the family's recent good fortune belonged to a young billionaire who almost never appeared in public, and that he might, just might, attend in person. Azin had decided that this mysterious man would meet her daughter. Adaku had decided the same. They had dressed the whole night like a snare. The cruelty of the house had sharpened in the weeks before the gala, as it always does when proud people grow anxious to impress. Adaku, strung tight with the importance of the night and the prize she meant to win, found fault with everything Oluchi did. The flowers were wrong. She made her redo 300 stems. The silver was not bright enough. She made her polish it twice. One evening, Adaku swept into the kitchen in a temper, found Oluchi resoling her shoe on the low stool, and stood over her and asked, with that cold, amused contempt that was the only warmth she had, whether the girl truly owned only one pair of shoes in the entire world. Oluchi, kneeling the glue bottle in her hand, said quietly that she did. Adaku laughed and said that was the most pathetic thing she had ever heard, and that Oluchi should be grateful the family even let someone like her stand on their marble. Then she knocked a tray of clean glasses off the counter on her way out, so that Oluchi would have to wash them all again, and she did it on purpose, and she smiled while she did it. Bisi, watching from the pantry with her fists clenched, whispered afterward that she did not know how Oluchi kept from screaming, and Oluchi only swept up the glass and said that a person who needed to break things to feel tall was a person to be pitied, not feared, and that she would not trade her own quiet heart for all of Adaku's gold. She believed it. But the words cost her something to say, and Bisi saw the cost and loved her more for it. For 2 days before the ball, Oluchi and Bisi, and the rest of the staff worked until their backs ached. They polished the marble until it mirrored the chandeliers. They arranged 1,000 stems of flowers, and the old groundskeeper, a lean, gray-haired man in his late 60s named Deacon Okoro, who tended the grounds and read his worn Bible on his lunch break, and had a gentle, weathered face that had seen far more of life than anyone in that house gave him credit for, hung the last of the lanterns along the drive and watched the staff hurry past and shook his head slowly. He had been at the Okafor house longer than anyone. He had watched Adaku grow from a sweet child into a hard woman, and it grieved him. On the morning of the gala, he found Oluchi re-soling her shoe yet again on the back step, the glue bottle balanced on her knee, and he sat down beside her with his old bones creaking and told her, in his quiet way, that he had lived long enough to see that the proud were always certain they were standing at the top of the world, right up until the very moment God turned the world over. Oluchi laughed softly and said she did not have time to wait for God to turn anything over. She had 300 glasses still to polish. But she remembered the words. She would remember them all night. The evening came down gold and warm. Cars filled the drive. The ballroom blazed, and among the long line of gleaming vehicles, a single luxury white SUV rolled quietly to the steps, and a man stepped out of it alone. He was 30, tall, with short, neat hair and a clean, strong jaw and warm, dark eyes, and he wore a plain black suit, beautifully made but plain, with a crisp white shirt and no tie. He waved off the valet with a small, kind smile and walked up the marble steps himself. And the strangest thing happened, the thing that would decide the whole night. Nobody recognized him. Because Chinedu had spent his rebuilt life avoiding cameras, the city's rich families knew his money but had never seen his face. Ezen and Adaku, scanning the room for a billionaire dripping in obvious wealth, looked straight at the quiet man in the simple suit and dismissed him as somebody's +1. Adaku, hunting bigger game, did not even nod to him. She would remember that too, before the night was through. So Chinedu moved through the great party unknown, a glass of water in his hand, watching with the wary patience of a man who has known both the bottom and the top, and trusts neither the way ordinary people do. And then, across the crowded floor, he saw her. She was leaning to pour water at a table near the wall. A slender girl in a sage green and cream dress and a white apron, her dark hair pulled back in a low, neat bun, her face tired and kind in a way that struck him like a hand laid flat against his chest. He could not breathe for a moment. He knew that face. He had carried that face up out of the rain, and through 2 years of climbing, his eyes dropped helplessly to her feet, and there they were, the cracked navy shoes, the split sole glued and glued and glued again, the exact shoes that had stood in the rain beside him while a bus he could barely afford to miss came splashing through the dark to carry him back to the living. His glass hung forgotten in his hand. He had found her. After 2 years, he had found her, and she was carrying water through a room full of people who did not know they were not fit to carry her tray. For a moment, he simply watched her, unable to move, afraid almost that if he blinked, she would dissolve like the thing he had chased through so many grateful faces and never caught. He watched her refill a guest's glass and step back with her head bowed, invisible to the man she served, as the people who hold up every gleaming evening are always invisible to the people enjoying it. He watched an older woman at the table drop her napkin without noticing, and watched Oluchi stoop quietly to retrieve it and set it back by the woman's hand, expecting no thanks and receiving none. He watched her catch a tottering champagne flute at the edge of a tray before it could fall, with the easy, practiced grace of someone who had spent her whole life keeping other people's beautiful things from breaking. And the longer he watched, the more certain he became, past any possibility of doubt, that this was her. Not only her face and her shoes, but her, the same gentleness, moving through the same tired body, doing the same small, unseen kindnesses for people who would never know her name. He thought of the rain. He thought of the bread pressed into his shaking hands. He felt something rise in his chest that he had not felt in 2 long years, something that was not quite joy and not quite grief, but had the size of both. And he knew that whatever else happened in that ballroom tonight, he was not going to leave it without crossing that floor and saying, at last, the thank you he had carried so far. He took 1 step toward her, and that was the moment Adaku decided to ruin everything. It happened as cruelty so often does, not as a great act, but as a small one, performed for an audience. Adaku had been holding court near the center of the floor, surrounded by her glittering friends, chief among them a sharp, lawing young woman in gold and orange lace named Ulari, who agreed with everything Adaku said before Adaku had finished saying it. The conversation had turned, as it always did, to who in the room did not belong. And Adaku, glancing about for a target, saw the kitchen girl come close with a tray, and saw, as Chinedu had seen, but with the opposite thing in her heart, the cracked navy shoes. "Will you look at that?" Adaku said, loud enough to carry, lifting one finger and pointing it straight down at Oluchi's feet. "We spend a fortune on this night, and they let the help walk our marble floor in shoes held together with glue. Look at them. Look at the state of those shoes." Ulari laughed first, high and sharp, and then the others, and then the laughter ran outward in a widening ring. The way a stone dropped in still water sends its circles to the very edge of the pond. People turned. Glasses paused. Oluchi stood absolutely still, the tray frozen in her hands, her face going hot and then very pale, her eyes dropping to the marble because she could not bear to lift them. "Honestly," Adaku went on, warming to the cruelty now, performing it, "if you cannot afford decent shoes, you should not be seen at an event like this at all. Go and hide in the kitchen where you belong. You are embarrassing my whole family in front of our guests." And the matriarch Izin, drawn by the noise, looked over the heads of the crowd at the girl in the cheap shoes and gave a small cold nod of agreement, as if to say, "Yes, take it away. It offends me." Oluchi did not argue. She had no power in that room and she knew it. She lowered her head and turned to go, the laughter still falling on her back like cold rain, the cracked shoes carrying her one more time toward a door. And she did not see, because her eyes were on the floor, that the entire ballroom had gone quiet behind her in a different way. Not the quiet of mockery. The quiet of a room that has just noticed that someone has begun to move through it like a change in the weather. Because the quiet man in the plain black suit had set his glass of water down on a passing tray, and stepped out of the crowd, and started across the open floor. If you have made it this far into Oluchi's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting the whole story to tell you. He walked without hurry, and yet everyone instinctively moved out of his way. There was something in the set of his shoulders, in the calm certainty of his stride, that made important people fall silent without understanding why. Adaku, still flushed and laughing from her own cruelty, saw him coming and arranged her face into its most dazzling smile, certain, utterly certain, that this handsome, well-dressed man was at last crossing the room to her, drawn by her wit, her beauty, the emerald light pouring off her gown. She lifted her chin, she parted her lips to greet him, and Chinedu walked straight past her as though she were a piece of the furniture, his eyes fixed on the girl in the apron who was almost at the door. "Wait," he said, not loudly, but the room was so silent now that the single word carried into every corner. Oluchi stopped. She turned, confused. Sure, he must be speaking to someone else, some guest behind her who needed a fresh glass. There was no one behind her. The man in the black suit was looking directly at her, and his warm, dark eyes were bright with something that, in the strangest way, looked almost like tears. He came to a stop a few feet from her, and the whole Gala held its breath, and then this stranger, this man no one could place, did the thing that broke the night clean in half. He inclined his head to her, a small, real bow, the kind a man gives to someone he respects, and he extended his open hand, palm up, and he said, gently, so that everyone heard it, "Would you do me the honor of a dance?" For a long moment, nobody breathed at all. Oluchi stared at his hand. She looked back up at his face, and somewhere far down in her memory something stirred and did not yet surface. "Sir," she whispered, I am only the help. There has been a mistake. You don't want to dance with me." And Chinedu smiled, and it was the gentlest thing that ballroom had ever witnessed. And he said, quietly enough that it was almost only for her, "There is no mistake. You are the only person in this room I came here to find." And he waited, his hand still open between them, while 300 of the city's proudest people stood frozen and could not have spoken if their lives had depended on it. And Oluchi, hardly knowing what she did, set her tray down on a side table with trembling hands, and put her small calloused hand into his. A sound went through the ballroom, not quite a gasp, not quite a sigh. The sound a crowd makes when something happens that rewrites the room. Somewhere off to the side, Adaku's dazzling smile had collapsed entirely. Ulari had gone silent for the first time all evening. Ezin's knuckles had whitened on her cane, and the band, after a stunned half-second, found its feet and began softly to play. Chinedu led her out into the very center of the marble floor, the floor she had polished on her knees 2 days before, and the crowd drew back to the edges and left them alone in a wide bright circle under the chandeliers. He set one hand at her waist and held her other hand up in his, and he began to turn her, slowly, with a grace that startled her, and he was careful, so careful, to move at a pace her cracked shoes could keep. She was stiff with fear and shame at first, certain she would be laughed at again, certain her ruined shoes would catch on the marble and send her sprawling for their amusement. But he held her steady, and after a moment she realized that nobody was laughing. The room that had been roaring with mockery only minutes before was watching in a silence so total she could hear the hem of her own dress whisper as she turned. "You are shaking," Chinadu said softly only to her as they turned. "Do not be afraid. Nothing bad is going to happen to you in this room tonight, not anymore." And Oluchi, looking up into the face of this impossible stranger, finally let the memory rise all the way to the surface. The rain, the broken light of the bus shelter, the shaking soaked man she had sheltered under her umbrella and fed with her last bread 2 years before. And her eyes went wide, and her hand flew halfway to her mouth, and she breathed a single word, "It's you." And Chinedu nodded, and his own eyes shone, and he said, "It has taken me 2 years to find you. I had begun to think God would not let me, and then I walked into this room tonight to give money to strangers, and there you were, carrying water, in the very same shoes." She did not understand yet. She did not know who he was, only who he had been to her. But the room was about to learn both at once. For at that moment the master of ceremonies, an elegant gray-haired man in a deep blue agbada who had been told in advance who was funding this gala, and had been searching the crowd all night for him in vain, finally caught sight of the man dancing in the center of the floor, and recognized, with a jolt, the face from the single private photograph he had been shown. He hurried to the podium. He tapped the microphone, and in a voice thick with awe, he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, honored guests, please. I have only just realized that we are in the presence of the founder and benefactor whose generosity has made this entire evening possible. The man dancing before you is Chinedu, the very billionaire whose foundation funds this charity, and whom so many of you have hoped all night to meet." The ballroom seemed to tilt. You could feel it go through the crowd like a wave. 300 wealthy, important people turning at once to stare at the plain-suited man they had spent the evening overlooking, the man Adaku had not bothered to nod to, the man whose hand was at this moment resting at the waist of a kitchen girl in glued-together shoes. And then, as one, every eye in the room dropped from Chinedu to the girl he was dancing with, and the full impossible shape of it landed on them. The richest man any of them would ever meet had crossed a ballroom full of heiresses and diamonds to bow to the maid they had just finished laughing at. This was the midpoint of the whole long night, the hinge on which everything turned. The stranger no one would greet was the one man in the room who owned the evening, and quietly it would emerge, the very foundation that had lifted the Okafor family's fortune, so that everything Adaku wore and stood on and looked down from had come, without her ever knowing it, from the hand of the man she had ignored. But that was not even the deepest part of the reversal. The deepest part was this: the cheap, cracked, glued-together shoes that Adaku had pointed at and mocked before the whole gala were the exact shoes that had stood in the rain beside a broken, ruined Chinedu on the worst night of his life, the shoes of the one stranger who had shown him mercy when he had lost everything else. The girl everyone scorned was the only reason the billionaire was alive to stand in that room at all, and he was not going to let a single soul there fail to understand it. Chinedu stopped the dance. He kept Oluchi's hand in his, steadying her, and he turned to face the silent, staring crowd. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, and it carried to every gilded corner of the hall. "You laughed at this woman's shoes tonight," he said. "I watched you do it. You pointed at her and you told her to go and hide in the kitchen because her shoes embarrassed you." He let that sit in the silence. "Let me tell you about those shoes. 2 years ago I lost everything I had. My business, my name, my place in the world, all of it, gone in a single season, and I walked this city in the rain one night with nowhere left to go and no reason left to keep going. And in that rain, at a bus shelter, a girl who had almost nothing stopped for me. She held her umbrella over me and let herself get soaked. She gave me the only food she had. She gave me her last money so I could get home, and she waited with me in the rain until the bus came so that I would not be alone. She never told me her name. She wanted nothing back. She did it because she was good." His voice did not waver. "I climbed out of that pit on the strength of that one kindness. Everything I have built since, every naira that funds this gala you are all enjoying tonight, I owe to the mercy of a stranger I spent 2 years trying to find. A stranger in a pair of cracked navy shoes." He looked down at Oluchi, and then back up at the crowd, and his eyes were hard now. "And tonight I walked into this room and found her at last, carrying your water. And the first thing I saw was you laughing at the shoes that saved my life. You could have heard a single coral bead drop on that marble floor." Adaku had gone gray beneath her flawless makeup. Ulari had shrunk back into the crowd, and Azin, the matriarch who had nodded so coldly for the girl to be taken away, stood gripping her useless cane with both hands, her mouth working, no sound coming out, as the full weight of what her family had done settled over her like a shroud. There was no need for anyone to shout at them. There was no need for a single cruel word in return. The truth itself had walked into the room and stood up straight, and the proud were left to stand in the wreckage of their own laughter while everyone watched. Deacon Okoro, the old groundskeeper, had slipped in at the back of the hall to see the lanterns lit, and he stood now in the doorway with his cap in his hands and tears running down his weathered face, and he was the only one in the entire room who was not surprised, because he had told the girl that very morning that the proud always stood certain at the top of the world right up until the moment God turned it over. He had not known he was watching for the answer to his own prophecy. He bowed his gray head and whispered his thanks to a God who, it turned out, was paying very close attention after all. What happened over the rest of that night, and the days that followed, was the slow and beautiful unmaking of every cruelty Oluchi had ever swallowed in silence. Chinedu did not parade her. He did not stand her on the stage and gloat. He simply did not let go of her hand. He asked her quietly whether she would let him repay even a small part of what she had given him, and Oluchi, overwhelmed, kept trying to refuse, kept saying she had only done what anyone should, that she wanted nothing. And that, of course, was exactly why he could not stop. The man had spent 2 years looking for someone who would want nothing, because the whole world he moved in wanted everything. He had found the one person who had given to him expecting never to be repaid, and he intended to spend a great deal of his fortune proving that heaven keeps better books than the proud imagine. He found Bisi in the kitchen, hiding behind the door, with her hands pressed over her mouth, having watched the whole impossible thing through the crack. And he thanked her, too, for being the friend who had kept Oluchi laughing through 2 hard years, and he saw to it that Bisi would never have to glue a shoe or fear a slammed door again either. When Bisi tried to stammer that she had done nothing, that she was only a kitchen girl, Chinedu told her gently that he had spent his whole climb back up surrounded by people who wanted to be near him, because of what he could give them, and that a true friend who stays through the hard years, asking for nothing, is rarer and worth more than any of them. He asked her what she had always dreamed of doing, before life had narrowed her down to a kitchen, and Bisi, hardly believing the question was real, admitted that she had always wanted to open a small place of her own, somewhere people could come and eat good food and feel welcome no matter how little money they had. Chinedu nodded slowly, as if she had said something wise, and within the year Bisi had her place, a warm, bright little restaurant near the market, and a hand-lettered promise on the wall that no one who was truly hungry would ever be turned away. And Oluchi was at the front table on opening day, weeping with joy for her friend, the two of them holding hands across the cloth the way they once had on the edge of a narrow bed. He sought out Deacon Okoro on the back step the next morning and sat with the old man and listened to him talk about the Lord turning the world over. And something in the young billionaire's face as he listened told the deacon that this was a man who had not let his money harden him, which was the rarest thing the old man knew. The two of them sat a long while in the early light, the billionaire and the groundskeeper, and Deacon Okoro told Chinedu that he had worked that estate for nearly 40 years, had watched a great deal of wealth pass through it, and had learned that money was a strange and revealing thing. It did not change a person so much as it magnified whatever was already inside them. A small heart with money turned cruel as Adaku's had. A good heart with money could do the work of angels if it stayed soft. He told Chinedu that he had prayed for that house for years, prayed that mercy would find its way back in through some door, and that he had nearly stopped believing the prayer would ever be answered. And then a girl in glued shoes had danced in the middle of the ballroom and answered it in front of 300 people. Chinedu took the old man's weathered hand in both of his and asked him, simply, to stay, not as a groundskeeper any longer, but as a kind of grandfather to the family he intended to build, a steady voice to keep them honest when the wealth grew as wealth always tries, to whisper that they had earned it all themselves. Deacon Okoro wept and said yes, And from that day the old deacon had a seat at their table and a Bible that was never far from his hand, and the house finally had the thing it had been missing for 40 years. And the kindness moved outward from there, rippling on past every life it touched as the laughter had once rippled across the ballroom floor. Except that kindness, it turns out, travels farther and lasts longer than cruelty ever can. As for Adaku and Ezin, there was no thunderbolt, no public destruction, no scene of revenge, because that is not how God settles these accounts, and it is not how this story settles them either. The proud were not humiliated by Oluchi, they were simply quietly displaced. By the end of the night, the guests who had spent years currying Ezin's favor had drifted to the center of the room where the billionaire stood, and the matriarch found herself standing rather alone at the edge of her own gala, her cane gripped in 2 hands, watching the kitchen girl she had ordered hidden away become the most honored person in the hall. Adaku, who had dressed the whole evening as a snare for the very man now holding her maid's hand, slipped out before midnight, unable to bear another moment of the room's cool, knowing glances. Some say she changed after that night, and some say the proud rarely do, but she never again pointed at anyone's shoes, and that, perhaps, is the most God can do with some hearts in one night. The cruelty had not been answered with cruelty. It had simply been emptied of its power, undone in an instant, like a shadow when somebody finally turns on the light. In the weeks that followed, the great house learned to call Oluchi by a different word than housegirl. Chinedu courted her the way she deserved to be courted, slowly, gently, with respect, never once making her feel that she owed him a single thing. He took her to see the city she had walked through poor and alone, now from beside her instead of behind. He showed her the shelter where he had once sat shaking in the rain, and they stood there together, the billionaire and the maid, 2 people who had met at the bottom of the world and were now climbing the rest of it side by side. And on the night he first brought her back to a gala, this time as his honored guest and not as the help, the whole long arc of her life seemed to bend and shine. She came down the grand marble staircase, the same staircase she had once polished on her knees, in a floor-length deep crimson-red sequin gown that caught the chandelier light and scattered it like 1,000 small fires. Her hair styled up with soft waves in a single gold pin, delicate gold drop earrings swinging at her ears, a thin gold bangle at her wrist. And at the foot of the stairs, Chinedu stood looking up at her with his heart in his eyes. And the same crowd that had once laughed her toward a kitchen door now turned to watch her descend in stunned, respectful silence. But here is the thing that mattered most, the thing the whole story had been building toward, the thing that separates a true reversal from an empty one. Oluchi came down those stairs in crimson and gold, and she was still herself. Her face was still kind. Her eyes still went, out of long habit, to the people serving the trays, and she smiled at each of them and learned their names. She had not become Adaku. She had not traded her gentleness for gold. She had simply, at last, been given a setting worthy of the diamond she had always been. The drab maid in the glued shoes and the radiant woman on the staircase were the same person all along, only now the world could finally see her, and she did not throw away the shoes. That was the one thing Bisi could never quite get over. When Oluchi packed her small bag of belongings to leave the servants' quarters for good, Bisi found the cracked navy shoes, the split sole glued for the 100th time, sitting on top of everything else, carefully wrapped in a clean cloth. Bisi asked her why on earth she was keeping them now that she could buy 1,000 pairs of anything she liked. And Oluchi held the worn shoes in both hands and looked at them for a long moment and said that these were the shoes that had carried her through every hard year of her life. These were the shoes she had worn in the rain the night she helped a stranger and asked for nothing. These were the shoes the whole world had laughed at, and they were the shoes that had walked her, in the end, all the way here. She would never throw them away. She would keep them where she could see them, so that no matter how high she climbed, she would never forget the girl who had glued them shut by a single bulb and gone to bed hungry and good. The gold could come and the gold could go, but she would never stop being the person who had stopped in the rain. The story of that night spread through the city, the way a flame spreads through dry grass. The tale of the heiress who mocked her maid's cheap shoes at the gala, and the billionaire guest who crossed the floor to ask her to dance. People who had been there told it, and people who had only heard it told it again. And everywhere it went, it carried the same small lesson tucked inside it like a seed, that you never truly know who is standing in front of you, and that the person you are tempted to look down on may be the very one heaven has marked for lifting up. Mothers told it to their daughters, old men told it on porches, and somewhere in the telling, the girl with the glued shoes stopped being a figure of pity and became something else entirely. A quiet proof that goodness is never wasted, even when it goes unseen for years. They were married in the spring in a great joyful wedding that filled the same ballroom with crimson and choral and song. Deacon Okoro, with tears in his eyes and his worn Bible in his hands, was given a place of honor, and Bisi stood beside Oluchi as her dearest friend. And when Chinedu stood to speak, he told the whole gathered crowd the story of the rain and bus shelter and the cracked shoes once more, so that no one would ever mistake what kind of woman they were celebrating or what kind of God had brought her there. He said that the world was full of people chasing wealth and beauty and status, climbing over one another to reach it, and that he had had all of it and lost all of it and learned the hard way that none of it was worth the price of becoming hard. He said the only treasure he had ever found that did not rot was the mercy of a poor girl who expected nothing back. And he said that if heaven was watching that rainy night, and he had come to believe with his whole heart that it was, then everything good that had happened since was simply God keeping a promise he makes to every gentle, overlooked soul who keeps doing right when no one is watching, that the lowly will be lifted up, and the proud will be brought down, and grace will find the humble in the end, no matter how long it takes or how cheap their shoes. The story did not end at the wedding. It is still going on, as the best of these stories tend to. Chinedu and Oluchi took the fortune the world had given them and turned it back toward the city that had once let them both fall through the cracks. They built shelters that were warm and dry, so that no one would ever again have to sit shaking under a broken light in the rain. And every season in the estate's great courtyard, they held a feast for the poor of the city, and Oluchi, in a softened version of her crimson gown, a simple cream wrap about her shoulders, knelt down in the golden evening light and handed out food and warm blankets and, to anyone whose shoes had given out, a brand new sturdy pair pressed into their hands with both of hers and a look that said, "I have worn shoes like yours. I have not forgotten you matter." Chinedu worked the line beside her, the billionaire on his knees in the dust, and the two of them gave the way she had once given him, freely, expecting nothing, because they had both learned that this was the only kind of wealth that ever truly belonged to anyone. And on the quiet evenings, when the feast was cleared and the guests gone home and then the city lights came up soft and gold against a dusk blue sky, Oluchi would sometimes walk out onto the terrace alone, and she would look down at the drive where the white SUV waited and the lanterns glowed, and she would feel the whole shape of her life: the kitchen, the glue bottle, the rain, the laughter on the marble floor, the open hand held out to her in front of 300 people who thought they were better than she was. And there, on a marble step beside the trailing hem of a crimson gown and a pair of fine new gold heels, the worn cracked navy shoes would be sitting where she always kept them, in the last warm light of the day. She would pick them up gently, with both hands, the way you cradle something precious. She would turn them over in her hands and run her thumb one more time over the seam she had, glued so many times, the seam that it held. And she would set them gently back down where they belonged, and she would smile, and she would whisper a small thank you into the gathering dark. So tell me, wherever you are watching from tonight, whatever country, whatever city, whatever quiet hard road you are walking yourself, drop it in the comments below, because I read everyone and this whole family is scattered across the world, and I love knowing where you all are. And tell me this too, because I truly want to know. If you had been standing in that ballroom that night, in your fine clothes, with the music playing and the heiress pointing her finger and the whole room laughing, would you have looked away and laughed along with them, the way the safe and the comfortable so often do? Or would you have been the one to cross the floor, take the trembling hand of the girl in the cheap shoes, and ask her to dance? Be honest, because the whole story comes down to that one choice, and so in the end, does a life. Some people spend everything they have trying to be the richest person in the room. The truly blessed ones learn, sooner or later, that it is far better to be the kindest.